The quality of a discourse is defined by the quality of the best ideas, not the quality of the worst ideas. And so it's more important to not kill high risk ideas that are potentially the best than it is to make sure you kill bad things. I think a world where Substack topples social media still feels kind of like in the future, but a world where Substack topples the mainstream media doesn't feel that unimaginable to me anymore. One of my sales pitches was just fuel up your getaway car. Start your Substack account. You don't have to do anything with it. You don't have to publish it. Just get it set up. Just have it there in case you ever need it. And a surprisingly high fraction of the time, we'd get a call back, sometimes as early as the next week, saying, "You'll never guess what happened."
Hi, welcome. This is the From the New World podcast. Today I'm speaking with Chris Best, the CEO of Substack. Chris was one of the pioneers when defending free speech on social media was the toughest. This was before Mark Zuckerberg's pivot, even before Elon bought X. He was one of the first. We discuss what that was like, what it's been like building Substack, and whether Chris will buy the Washington Post. That sounds interesting to you. You should subscribe and you should let a friend know, either in person or online. That's the best way to help us out, and not only are you helping us, but you're helping a friend find something interesting and informative. Without further ado, here's Chris Best. Welcome to the show, Chris Best.
Thanks for having me.
So, you're the CEO and co-founder of Substack. You were really leading the charge long before Zuck is now changing his content policies. What was it like when you started Substack? What was the speech climate like?
So we started Substack originally in 2017. My reason for wanting to start the company stemmed from my sort of dissatisfaction with the online media ecosystem. Actually, the company started out as like an essay that I was writing, complaining about that. And part of that dissatisfaction was what I saw as sort of like excessively censorious policies on some of the major platforms, but also just, I think, maybe perverse incentives overall that some of these platforms created.
And I really want readers to have a lot of context, because I think this has been improving for a while. The amount of censorship has been declining for a while. So in 2017, things will have been very, very different than today in terms of what, the policy was, in terms of what other social media platforms were doing. Can you tell us more about your competitors at the time, where they were falling short?
Well, okay. So flashback to 2017, maybe it's best characterized by kind of the blue check era of Twitter,
Yes.
where, Twitter had this verification system where they had given out verification badges, which were simultaneously, gave you some advantage in distribution, but were also kind of this status signal. And they'd given them out primarily, I think, on the basis of people's affiliation with legacy media organs. And so there was this interesting moment in history where, a lot of the legacy media still felt very important and relevant. And there was, to my mind, quite a lot of groupthink. And there was sort of like a party line that held sway in a lot of the legacy media. And then that cachet had sort of spilled onto Twitter, which had become the de facto center of the discourse. And the joke of the time was like, Twitter's not on the masthead of these publications, but what goes on Twitter is effectively controlling what happens. All of these reporters, all of these writers are addicted to Twitter. It's their sort of professional network. It's also their status. It's the place they're spending their time. And so there was this kind of like hybrid hive mind, in my estimation, between a lot of the like legacy media organs and sort of like the central blue check Twitter universe. And it left a lot to be desired. I think it was, failing to produce a lot of interesting new ideas in my estimation.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with a ton of that. And what's really interesting, I listened to a few interviews you did a few years ago, And you really saw a connection between that medium inherently, the medium of Twitter and the kind of mob style behavior, censorious behavior. Can you explain a little bit more the significance of that?
Like there was definitely a long moment there where people feared getting canceled on Twitter above all else, and especially in media. There was sort of this universe of like, if you get dogpiled on Twitter, that is real life to you because it really does threaten your employment. It really does threaten your standing within your professional circles. I mean, one of the things that I sometimes would have joked at the time was that the thing that Twitter specifically and maybe a lot of the social media platforms of the day were really good at creating a false sense of consensus, by which I mean, you can have, if you have, you know, 100 people who are really exercised about something and they all kind of like show up in your replies and they all kind of are yelling at you and by retweeting you, and they're kind of like, you can get to a world where a relatively small number of very dedicated people can kind of like create sort of false common knowledge where it sort of feels like it feels like everybody in the world hates you and is mad at you when really it's like 100 very online people who are yelling at you. And that was sort of like in some ways like a fiction that became a reality. There was a little bit of like a hyperstitious effect there where the fact that it was perceived to be powerful actually made it powerful. And I think it felt very oppressive to a lot of people, and it felt, I think, maybe selectively oppressive to the people I think are the most interesting writers and thinkers, who felt like what they could write about or what they could say was sort of very tightly circumscribed by the norms of that professional clique, basically.
Yeah, it was like, Marshall McLuhan, I warn of the global village. Mark Zuckerberg, at long last, we have created the global village from Marshall McLuhan. And
I mean, Mark ended up feeling the horns of his own creation. I think like he's been roasted on social media as much as anybody, I imagine, at this point.
yeah, I'm roasted on social media and, taken to Congress and, singing a bit of a different tune now. It's really interesting because with Elon's purchase of Twitter, now X, you know, there's kind of two types of arguments, right? And I think both of them are in part true. One is, it was really what caused the vibe shift that, by having X have, a different polarity than all these other social media platforms, you really brought many other stories to the fore. But, you're seeing increasingly now a bit of a different critique, which maybe lines up with what you were saying, that what Elon's done is just flip the switch from kind of left to right. Instead of getting mobbed by left wing people, you're getting mobbed by right wing people. Do you think that second narrative holds true still?
Oh, that there's just been like a polarity flip. I definitely
Yeah.
see signs of that. I don't think it's matured and to the point that it had in the other direction in the past. But you definitely see, things to me that feel like right wing cancel mobs and right wing purity spirals. And I think it's almost like a maybe a long truism in American politics that like whoever's like out of power are the free speech advocates, right? Like
Yeah,
the
everyone wants free speech for ideas they agree with.
Well, like maybe another way to put this is there are relatively few consistent principled defenders of free speech on principle, or at least that those people are dwarfed by the number of people who are pro free speech when their side are the ones feeling the brunt of censorship. And then as soon as they become ascendant and they're the ones in a position to decide what's allowed and not, there's like sort of a ring of power effect where it's very tempting to turn around and use that power for your own side. It's easy to be a defender of free speech for your own side and for your own interest.
I'm curious what your experience with this is. because what many people who may be in support of, from their perspective, would be more content moderation, more kind of community health. They would say that, the purpose of that moderation is to create kind of a venue for more reasoned debate, right? Basically, there's like two theses here, right? One thesis is that, those people are really, really concerned about the quality of debate. And if you have the same ideas expressed in a kind of long form, deliberative, evidence based way, as you see a lot in Substack, that they would stop criticizing that. And then you have, another line of thought. They just don't like it being discussed at all, and they would be equally critical if it's on Substack. Which of those would you say is more true in your experience?
I'll tell you one thing, there's no set of policies or positions that we could put forward that people would not be mad at us. I've seen
Fair
enough
enough.
to know that that's the case. There is no, you're running an internet forum. There is no everybody's happy with how it's going kind of universe. And I think you do have to think a little bit from first principles about what you're trying to do and how you can best serve that. One thing that I do think is a common false dichotomy is the idea that like there's basically only two ways that this can work. One is you're going to have a very tightly, moderated, rule enforced kind of like, a heavy-handed, and I'll try to say this in a neutral way, like, on the either you're going to have really strong, centrally enforced rules and standards, or you can have kind of like freewheeling anarchy where anybody says anything to anybody with complete impunity. And I think a lot of maybe what I think of as the first generation of social media kind of did suffer that trade off structurally, both because of how it was designed and because what the incentives of the business model were, which was to maximize engagement. Like if you build a really effective engagement maximizer, like just by the nature of what you're maximizing for, if you like don't ride herd on that thing, it's going to devolve in a certain way. And if you do ride herd on it, it's going to like, come with some of the predictable problems that we saw. And so I think there's like a certain amount of like pessimism out there that says, you're listen, you're stuck between these two evils. Like either you're going to have, you know, strongly enforced rules, which run the risk of being, overbearing and misused by whatever team is in control of the ship, or you're going to have kind of this just like anarchic free for all where people are just shouting and screaming and yelling at each other, and that's can't do anything about it because you don't want to censor people. My vision for Substack has always been like I think there's a way you can you can Pareto improve on both those things. Like I think there are ways you can add structure. Substack, the ideal for Substack to me is not that it's unmoderated. It's that the majority of moderation comes from people who have their own space that they control. And rather than having one centralized, like a centralized authority that we run take a really strong view of what's true and good and acceptable across a wide range of topics, we set like a very permissive sort of umbrella policy. And then we give people who run their own Substacks a lot of leeway to set potentially much tighter rules. And you can have actually, a space on Substack where you could have arbitrarily stringent rules. You could say nobody's allowed to ever curse, or you could even say every comment has to be substantive and thoughtful. Right? You could go the other way and have a bar for quality where you're actually pushing for something aspirational. So I think I think there's room for design of these things where we're not stuck in the dichotomy that everybody sort of imagined that we were in the 2010s.
What's the deal with Substack Notes?
What's the deal with Substack Notes?
Yeah, well, what's the thinking behind it?
Well, okay, so the big thinking behind it was, we built Substack as this platform where people could subscribe. You go and you sign up, and you have these like deep relationships uh, with individual publications. They're sending you stuff. That all works really well. And then that machine was completely and utterly dependent on the various social media platforms for distribution. And that meant, both we were kind of like commercially at the whims of these things. Like, when we had a
Like you can get banned off, or you can get all of the links deboosted off Twitter.
yeah, like we have a spat with Elon and that happens, or even like it's honestly like, just like Meta decides they don't want to have any discussion of politics for a little bit, and like all the politic links, like it's like some of it was like, deliberate action against Substack, and some of it was just like, hey, we changed our algorithm, or like we don't want links, or we don't
Wait,
want
so I don't
politics.
know this. So for Meta, was it how did the politics deboosting work exactly? Did they like hit the entire Substack domain?
No, no, we didn't have anything like that with them, but there would be like, if somebody wrote there were I heard a lot of anecdotes of the forum, like I wrote a pretty anodyne article that touched on US politics in some way that's not in any way offensive or shocking, but when I went to put it on Facebook, I was either prevented or it was sort of like the reach was greatly limited because they, for their own reasons, had decided to like avoid having, what when it was banned was political content, when it came back was civic content. And that was just like, people on Substack were downstream of all of those things. And we want you, if you're a Substacker, we want you to be able to promote your work everywhere. Link to it on Twitter, post it on Instagram, put the podcast on Spotify, put the video on YouTube, like be everywhere. But we felt more and more strongly that there should be one space that people, it was a destination that people could proactively come to, that would give them a view into the world that was economically aligned with their interests. Like we do want you to be able to read long form stuff. We do want you to be able to get subscribers that discover your work. We don't have a conflicting, stakeholders that want different things. Within that space, you're less downstream of the incentive effects of those other platforms. So
Yeah.
we wanted to create a space where you could get discovered, where if I'm looking to like grow my audience, there's a place that you can do that. And it's actually worked for that in quite dramatic fashion. It's the Substack app is driving a very substantial fraction of people's growth on the platform.
Yeah, I know. I want to make this podcast good for you, and so maybe we can talk more about Substack and less about the competitors. This is just something that I observed with Substack that felt very different from every other platform. Maybe it changed a little bit with notes, but that you really had, I think for other platforms, there was a kind of like myth of siloing effects, but in, Twitter or Facebook or so on, you didn't really get siloing effects. You had, people engaging each other, or sometimes adversarially, mostly adversarially, but it wasn't really a siloing effect. The exception might be YouTube. And, certainly I think in my experience, the exception is Substack as well, where like you have all of these like really strong movements. This is something Substack is just great for, is the movements kind of feeding off of each other, right? Like you have the kind of center left abundance movement, like the Noah Smith, Matt Iglesias kind of people, and you have all of their kind of kingdom and people like one step down from them. And then you have the kind of, never Trump right, and they have very big Substacks and they have their whole infrastructure, right? And then you have, the kind of tech people. You have, right wing version of this and a left wing version of this, and then you have, like the Substack like novelists, the serialized novelists,
Yeah.
and so you have a lot of communities, and it's really interesting because you get like links back and forth through them, and you can kind of trace through these things and they kind of bring back the magic of the old blogosphere. But compared to a lot of different platforms, it feels like really siloed. Like I very rarely see the like, I don't know. I don't see the Matt Iglesias Mark Andreessen crossover. It hasn't happened.
The, say more about that.
I don't know. Like, actually, I said YouTube was a bit more siloed before, but actually, maybe this contradicts that assertion, because in YouTube you see this a lot, where and it's sort of explicitly encouraged with their conferences and so on, where big creators from different kind of subgenres or different genres even will like get together and do a collab. Right. It might just be from like different video games or something like that. It's maybe it's maybe different than a kind of intellectual debate, but it's still very interesting, and evidently like a lot of people are interested in it. And even on Twitter, a lot of the time it takes place in the form of like a debate or, some kind of argument, some kind of quote tweet war, but it's very entertaining at least. And it's interesting because I think you get like back and forths between people in the same movement, you get like Matt Iglesias and Noah Smith arguing about nuclear power, right, which was also really fun to read. And you get that kind of thing on Substack, but you don't get the kind of like big like cross ideology debate. At least in my experience. I might be wrong.
I think you do get some of that. And I do think that's something that is positive to have if it's done in like a good way. Like I think
Oh, absolutely.
you want to have some siloing, you want to have some ability for sort of like schools of thought to form and people to like have their own spaces, but you also want, you want ideas to be in conversation with each other, both like so that you can grow and reach new audiences, and because when these ideas come into contact with each other, like that's where the interesting stuff happens, right? People, I definitely, there's definitely a good set of like beefs you can find on Substack if you go and look for them. We're making a lot of tools. The app does this. The live when we released our new live feature, we release it initially with a collab component. Like you can go live with some.
Yeah.
It's almost like an easier way to do like a simpler way to do a video podcast. It's like a FaceTime that turns into a video podcast. And so I think it should be when you want to, you can put your ideas in contact with others. You can have a fight. You can have an argument. You can, mix things together. I think that's part of what makes things interesting.
Yeah, and I'm really optimistic about this. I believe in you. I think you'll make it happen. Yeah. It's the live feature is really interesting because you remember Clubhouse.
I do.
You do want to explain Clubhouse and the kind of life cycle of Clubhouse?
So Clubhouse was a
It's
really
basically Twitter Spaces, right?
I mean, it was Twitter Spaces. It was like a live drop-in conference call audio room that went through an absolutely meteoric arc during sort of like the COVID lockdowns, and there during its heyday, it was sort of like it felt like this sort of new agora or something. There was this new space where like a lot of the most interesting and like the real players in the world, you could drop in and you'd find them talking amongst themselves, and you could sit down and listen, and maybe you could even get invited on the stage and talk to them. There was one moment I remember where I think it might have been Solana actually was like railing against Chesa Boudin, and then
And then
Chesa
he
showed
shows
up,
up. The
and
guy
then,
shows up.
and then we found out that he's like a trial lawyer and pretty good at arguing.
Yeah.
And there was sort of like this really exciting moment. It had this huge, they did this really smart rollout. It had this really huge kind of like rise, got to tons of users very quickly. I think, raised a bunch of money. And then I think it eventually kind of like plateaued and came back down and is not that well used anymore. But there was like this really powerful cultural moment to my mind where there was like something sort of magical that had happened there. What's your take on Clubhouse?
Yeah, there was something. I think Clubhouse didn't understand where it was going and kind of skated off a cliff. But where it was going, what really worked about it, and it was very fleeting, was this idea that you had um you had a kind of first class of people who already had name recognition, and then you had like a second class of people who they were kind of familiar with, right? And they could like bring those people on as like a rotating cast, and those people would just like drop by. You wouldn't necessarily schedule this ahead of time, although some people did. And you would have, like Mark Andreessen or Mike Solana or Balaji or all sorts of people who were kind of tier one, who are already like people who were known quantities. And you would have like people in their circle, maybe like anons or maybe Substack writers, independent writers, so on. And one of those people would have read something they wrote, and they would say, come on stage, let's talk about this, let's talk about a thing you wrote, let's talk about a concept that you kind of coined. And that was really interesting. And I think the reason that, you know, that Clubhouse failed is that it just got so diluted. It just got so hard for those people to keep track of the tier two. And some of them have told me this. It gets so hard to keep track of the tier two that that original magic just got so diluted.
I can see that being part of it. The other piece that I suspect is that, making live, like exclusively live work, has this really tricky constraint. Like there's a reason that people don't do like appointment viewing television anymore. Like it is just much more disruptive to say you have to tune in at a specific time or else you'll miss the thing. On the flip side, that's part of the magic. It makes it ephemeral. And I think there was a moment where like in the lockdowns, everybody was like sitting there at home and it kind of didn't matter as much. We were like, oh man, if I could just like talk to somebody right now, I would totally do that. And like people fit it into their lives. My my hunch is that the true magic of the live part is that it gives you permission to do it in that ad hoc way. You're not necessarily scheduling it. You can do it kind of off the cuff. You feel like you have permission to not make a big deal about it. Like if you want to go and like schedule a podcast interview with Mark Andreessen, there's a whole, shebang to do about that. But if he like drops in on an interesting conversation, that you can just sort of have that happen. It can feel very frictionless. And I think if you could combine sort of like the frictionlessness and the just off the cuff, let's have a conversation part of live, and then have those things remove the constraint that says, well, if you're not there, you just missed it. I think that could be pretty interesting.
Yeah, there's something very alluring about the shared secret, right? You're there, you're there for it. You have, very important people articulating their thoughts, and then it's gone. And
Yeah.
you had very controversially as well. This was the other aspect of the shared secret is that you would have, journalists go in and record the stuff. Maybe against TO,
People felt
sometimes
like it
against
was
TOS,
ephemeral.
right?
People felt like they could be open and it was ephemeral, and so they were being less guarded maybe about what they said. And then you would have narcs join and kind of like tell on them, which was
Yeah, but I think on the perspective of the platform, it almost is a selling point. Like you want to be there, you want to be there for the shared secret, and once in a while, as long as it wasn't too often, once in a while it would just emerge and you would leak. You would get this like huge breaking news headline in the New York Times that comes from a clubhouse space, and you just had to have been there. And if you weren't, then you didn't hear it. It's this very kind of pre enlightenment kind of media almost.
yeah, there were a lot of takes flying around of like, we're going back to an oral culture. And like, this is just, the return of XYZ thing from antiquity,
You a
which
fan of
was
Marshall McLuhan?
a bit.
Yeah, I mean, have you thought about a specific lesson from McLuhan? Is there like a McLuhan quote that like kind of comes back to your mind, like Professor Oak and Pokemon? Of you're building out this new media platform. You have a very different philosophy of media than a lot of the incumbents. Is there a McLuhan quote that kind of pops back into your mind over and over again as you're doing that?
If I'm honest, I think I probably get most of my McLuhan just like in the water supply. Like I'm not,
Yeah, yeah.
I haven't read much McLuhan.
Some would say that that's the most faithful way to enjoy McLuhan.
There you go. But like the basic idea that like, hey, the medium shapes what we, the medium is the message, whatever that thing is. The formats that we use shape heavily the emergent experience, and property matters a lot. I also think I sometimes think of these things through like a little bit of like a neo-Darwinian lens of like, hey, are we, we're to some extent we're creating like a mimetic evolutionary landscape, and you have like selfish memes that propagate or don't. And there's always going to be things that thrive. There's always going to be modes of critique that kill things and or remove them from the population. And the question is kind of like, you know is that set up in a way where the the winners, or that it tends to create things that are interesting and useful? Feels like the important question to me. And you can definitely create a mimetic evolutionary landscape that is heavily used and very sort of vibrant, and that isn't creating a lot of, to my mind, useful output. That's a possible thing to do.
Yeah, they can be, degenerative or generative. What makes a generative social media platform?
I think you need, as we were saying before, a healthy balance between the silo, or the, people call the echo chamber, if you're if you're being dismissive. You don't want to have a complete sort of like everybody's shrieking into the same open field. You want to have spaces, you want to have some structure, you want to have, you know, smaller places where people can congregate and have schools of thought. And then you also want to have those things come into contact. So you do want to have that balance between kind of like the silo and the central forum. I think ideas are a strong link problem, right? The quality of a discourse is defined by the quality of the best ideas, not the quality of the worst ideas. And so it's more important to not kill high risk ideas that are potentially the best than it is to make sure you kill bad things. And so I think you want to have, robust free speech protections. You want to have mechanisms by which, if you have an intransigent minority or an intransigent individual that's interested in pursuing some line of thought, they're free to do that. You raise the variance and you get interesting things that way. And then eventually you want, I think, being able to make money from it helps a lot, right? If you're able to like, if you're doing something that's like interesting and valuable to even a small set of people, if that thing can thrive and if it can get you financially rewarded enough to like justify investing more effort into it, I think that's very worthwhile. I think often if you have sort of like, it's not true of everybody, but if you have at least the opportunity to sort of professionalize, if you're onto something interesting, that can be generative.
Freddie DeBoer said he wasn't expecting to go viral essentially and be able to make a living writing full time, and he
He's
was
he's written to
basically
be. I
weeks.
think he was like days away from taking a manual labor job.
And
I mean,
yeah,
as like
it,
ask like Slaystar Codex had been offline for a year or something. That was killing me.
yeah. What's the best Substack?
What's the best Substack?
Yeah,
You can't ask me that.
it's like one of those things where you don't pick a favorite child.
Yeah, who's your favorite child? Well, there's cb.substack.com. That's my Substack, so it's the best
Naturally, the
but
best
in one
Substack.
sense. There's a lot of really good ones.
What is the most controversial Substack?
That's another one you can't ask me.
Well,
There's
I'm not saying what do you but just based on like inbound traffic, you know, just based on like what other people what do the numbers say?
I'm not going to tell you
Is
that.
there like a sort by controversial?
No.
No, no.
What?
Would that be bad for the platform if you could see like what is the Substack that the most like both that has like the closest ratio of like positive to negative
I
stuff that
think
people are
like
saying about it?
listen, you want to be able to support things that are controversial, but I don't think you necessarily want to optimize for what's the most controversial.
You don't have to tell me, but like, do you know? Is there a like internal like controversy meter?
No, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure the question is even well formed. Like depends on how you define controversy. Controversial among who? What's the measure of that? Suffice it to say, there are many Substacks that are loved and hated in different quarters.
Well, one way to define it would be controversial among the authorities. I'll try to make this the last time I talk about Zuck, but recently Zuck said there were people in the Biden admin very angry about certain posts. Elon said the same thing about Twitter. Has there been any American law enforcement official that has been angry about a specific post on Substack?
I don't think we have any stories that are kind of like directly analogous to what came out in the Twitter files or some of the stuff that Zuckerberg's talked about on Rogan. we've been, we haven't had the government knocking our door saying, you know, we just don't like this person, take them down. Yeah.
And so that was for America. Did you ever have that experience with a European?
Not in the same way. There's sort of like there's a steady stream of various like legal things that happen on a platform like Substack, but yeah, not in the way that you're asking. I don't think.
Let's do the whole world now. Any takedown requests from China?
I think we're blocked in China. They are.
Oh man, okay, so everything.
So the very first Substacker was this guy Bill Bishop who writes Cynicism, which is a newsletter sort of about China for an international business and government audience. And so I think,
Oh, is it cynicism like
yeah, like
Sinocism? Yeah, yeah,
Sinocism.
that's an amazing pun.
And he started out like he had an email newsletter because it allowed him to like get around the Great Firewall more easily back in the day. And so I think we got banned in China much earlier than we otherwise might have, just by virtue of him being our first our first.
Oh man, poor guy. That's rather unfortunate.
I think it would have happened sooner or later anyway.
Yeah, I mean, fair enough. With the TikTok ban, are there any TikTok refugees changing to Substack
Yeah,
instead
I
of,
made a
you know?
TikTok account this weekend. I've been like making TikTok videos. It's a whole new experience for me.
Okay, so you're enjoying TikTok on like the last 4 days of TikTok.
Yeah, I've been like, wow, this is fun. It's too bad that I didn't. How do you feel about the TikTok ban? Are you happy?
So I don't use TikTok. I do think it's like, and there's been some articles showing this, like legit, like, very well documented articles showing, that they do in fact send data back to China, and this is in the court filings as well. I think just based on just based on the ownership and kind of revenge almost of what China's doing to us, what China is doing to you specifically included, you know it would be more controversial if I think it was a country that wasn't blocking all of our apps. I think it's pretty reasonable, especially the way the law that's written, which is not a strict ban, but saying you have to sell the U.S. subsidiary, possibly to Elon, as people are reporting. I don't actually know if that's credible or not, but there are some
It's a
some reports of that.
it's a test of the theory that the most entertaining outcome is the most likely.
Yeah, yeah. Can you imagine like an Xified TikTok?
Oh man,
That would sure be something. you know, Merging two very distinct types, very distinct aesthetics of slop. Returning to the idea of the kind of marketplace of ideas or Darwinian memes, evolution of memes on Substack. One factor that might, some people would say destroy, some people might say improve, augment, accelerate this evolution is of course AI. What do you think AI will do to the kind of content creation incentives on Substack?
I'm very excited for the impact of AI on Substack. I think there's sort of like two ways in which it's a real tailwind. People complain that all like now that there's generative AI, we're going to be kind of like flooded in slop, and there'll be more things on the internet that we could ever possibly read or watch or pay attention to. But of course, that's already true. Like that's we've been in that world for a while, and this is kind of just an intensification. I think when you have sort of like super abundance of content of things that you could pay attention to, it actually raises the value of having trusted sources to help you curate a slice of your attention. When you subscribe to somebody on Substack, I think you're not primarily paying to get an amount of content. Like nobody's like, I need to get more emails, I better pay for some. You're paying for a perspective, right? You're paying for a slice of somebody to help you know what matters. I think that gets more valuable, not less. And I think it gives the people making that stuff creative leverage. And so, to the extent that you have a perspective, and to the extent that that's what people are paying for, now it gets easier and easier to like make good media from that perspective. We go back to the live thing. We've made this live like live feature where I can just have a FaceTime call with you, and then it magically gets recut into like a high quality podcast episode. We make the audio sound good. We make the resolution higher. We can like generate clips that are, the pull out the best moments and make that really easy. You can add transcripts, you can translate it, you can turn like all of the things that kind of like go into the sort of like mechanics of making media. There's like this whole new set of tools that are sort of like wonderful and magical. And so I'm very excited. I think it kind of raises the value of what's on Substack, and it gives creative leverage to people who are making the stuff. I do think there's like another, there's a different world that it also accelerates. I think of this as sort of like the media as drug future, where, one reason that people consume media is just for kind of like its short term effect on you, like as a distraction, as an opiate, as as like a thing to kill your mind and tickle your limbic system. And I definitely think that, you know, we're going to hit soon, if we haven't already hit a point where AI can do that very effectively. And that is going to be kind of like, potentially quite negative thing to the extent that people like get addicted to it and become dependent on it. But I think we'll live in a world that has both, and Substack will be the former.
Well, it's really interesting because um so I had this idea that what's really getting in the way of like the AI companions is not other AI companions or even people, but it's TikTok. It's TikTok, it's Reels that like the really addictive stuff is not LLMs, right? It's not even text. Like TikTok is not really text, right? Maybe you have like closed captions or something, but it's mostly not text. And it's the same deal with like YouTube, the stuff that people spend a long time on. I guess you do have some people, scrolling. Certainly, surely you have people like scrolling Substack notes, doom scrolling Substack notes for hours on end. Maybe not. I don't
No,
know.
no. If you're into if
Um,
you're into AI Substack, you're foom scrolling. That's what I say.
yeah, yeah. Or I don't know if people get lost in like Substack archives like they get lost on Wikipedia. Maybe that's an option. But I do think that's like the minority of people, right? Most of the people who are really addicted, they're on like TikTok or they're on YouTube. They're not on tech stuff. And yeah, if he becomes, voice, if he becomes like her, like the movie, maybe then it can compete with TikTok. But right now, like the language models, they're just like not that parasocial, right? They're just like insufficiently advanced. Like even the character stuff, there was some scandal around character right now, but just at like an objective level, character AI is just not. It just doesn't hit the limbic system in the same way that TikTok or Reels or YouTube does.
I think that's true. I think video as a medium is different. I kind of think it's like similar to like product UI development in some ways. It kind of like
Yeah, yeah.
you're talking directly to the lizard brain. Like there are things that work or don't work in video that are kind of like pre-linguistic. Like they just sort of like
Yes.
have this direct effect on you. I think that is probably true. I think you might be underestimating character AI and the extent to which there is already like a large set of people who are talking to and forming relationships with these things, which is not a totally new phenomenon. Like even before AI, there's been, do you know about the phenomenon of like fictosexuals,
Yes, yes.
right? People who like,
I learned about this on Substack.
you learned about this on Substack. Perfect. I think Catherine D has written about this.
Yes, Catherine D's Substack specifically.
But there's people who, you know, lead whole imaginary relationships with characters from fiction even before they could talk to them, right? And so it's not, perhaps not surprising, but I do think like I think there's something happening there. I think there is a set of people. It's not quite TikTok yet. It's not quite a video thing yet, but it's going to be interesting to see what happens. I think there's a set of people who are like spending a lot of time with AI companions.
What's Substack's policy on erotica? Like not like overtly sexual stuff, but
We have
like
the
romance novel equivalents.
we have the very easy to define and enforce policy that porn is prohibited, but erotica is allowed.
Very easy to define.
because I mean, for exactly this reason, like we wouldn't want to prohibit romance novels or, I think there's kind of like, you can read our content guidelines if you want to get into the details, but the intent
Are
of it is basically like, yeah, no porn, but erotica.
are you aware of a website called Archive of Our Own?
I have heard of Archive of Our Own. It's
What
mostly people.
percentage? Oh, sorry, go on.
It's mostly people like doing like shipping fanfic, right?
Yes, of varying degrees of eroticism.
Explicitness.
What, or more than eroticism, what percentage of archive of of our own content do you think would be Substack TOS compliant?
I don't know enough to say, I'm afraid.
Okay, just wondering if you were thinking of kind of eating up that market.
I mean, I do think the fan like there's definitely interesting stuff here, interesting stuff there, but I don't know enough to say to answer the question. I'm afraid.
Okay, understandable, understandable. Going back to AI, because I think we had a very important point there that you made that I think is worth going back to. There's this, there's this open question, and it can be a yes and of how much of the information that we consume either on Substack or anywhere else is for the information itself or kind of for the social content, right? Like there are a lot of people on Substack who, to give a little bit of nuance to it, who write like who teach me new things every day, every time I read their Substack. Many of whom have been interviewed on this podcast, but also who I read because like I know them. Like I want to know what they're thinking. Want to know what they're writing about. They're my friend. In many cases, it's not just parasocial because I also meet them in real life a lot of the time. But there are also some that are who I just know from their online presence. What percentage of reading for my friends or like reading for information do you think is the average Substack?
I think it's mostly an expansive definition of the former, right? Like I sort of flippantly said earlier, people aren't paying to get more emails. I think there are probably some, there's hedge funds that subscribe to actionable trading newsletters on Substack and that stuff. And I sometimes expect even there that you get a lot of perspective.
Yeah, we're doing the $100,000 semi-analysis subscription.
Hey, it's good. It's good. People are paying it.
Yeah, I endorse this.
I think, okay, the way I might put this is, what's the point of culture? Like, what are you actually getting from something that you read or something that you watch or listen to or put into your mind? And part of it is like, you know, getting something that you want. You want to learn something, you want to be entertained, you want to like, have some content to pay attention to. But I think a large fraction of it is learning what to want, deciding what to want. You're kind of like you're doing your own training run that like shapes your own objectives and shapes your own, we're kind of like social creatures in that, what we want and what we care about matters. We want to feel like we're acting back on our environment. When you pay for somebody on Substack, when you participate, when you read, you're not just, consuming something in your own private universe. You're like participating in a larger reality. It's kind of like the human alignment problem, right? Like we have not solved that. And I think that's a larger fraction of what people actually want from media and from culture than is commonly understood, even by the people themselves.
Yeah. Are you a fan of Rene Girard?
Again, I kind of like I get all my Girard secondhand through, the the tech repeaters of his ideas.
Any favorite Girard Substacks? This is an entire genre now of Girard Substacks.
I mean, the only one that I can think of off the top of my head that even qualifies is, I guess, is Luke Burgess
Yeah, he's on Substack. He's great.
and he's a Girard. Am I thinking of the right?
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. A lot of people that I read have been influenced secondhand through Girard. I do think the fundamental idea that, the mimetics of desire, the idea that we copy what to want from other people, I think is like a powerful and true insight.
But you know how it ends, right?
we end up killing someone for a weird ritualistic psychological needs.
Yeah, yeah. So, well, there's the short term and then there's the long term of how it ends. Yeah, the short term, at least in pre-Christian times, is you copy someone, but if too many people are competing for the same thing, we have to kill someone.
Yeah, I've never quite understood that leap in Gerard. It's like, I
Well,
guess,
there's one way to think of it, which is, if you're all, you know, most things are only have limited elasticity, right? You can only produce so much of a thing. So if enough people are competing for it, if like all of society is competing for something, odds are society can't produce enough of that thing to, satisfy everyone. And then, what happens? You would at least expect there to be violence, right?
yeah, you might say, okay, there's going to be a zero sum competition and violence, but I think that's not what Gerard doesn't predict. That Gerard predicts like a scapegoating and kind of ritual mass psychosis sacrifice of a.
Well, he predicts both. So
Oh,
so the theory is that you'll have escalating violence and, to solve the violence, people then scapegoat something.
that's interesting. Do you have a Gerardian take on the United Healthcare assassination?
Well, there are several ways in which I'm not a Gerardian. And one of the ways that I'm not a Gerardian is I think that many people just have a desire for violence. Yeah, there is a Gerardian take. It's not my take, but there is a Gerardian take that, you know, the healthcare system is this kind of like false monopoly and it's very competitive, but in the political lane instead of in the market lane. And, you can kind of see the UHC CEO as a kind of scapegoat. Not sure I agree with it a lot.
I think your explanation is better. I think people have a thirst for violence. It's thrilling in some way. A lot of people saw that thing happen, felt excited about it, and then had to talk themselves backwards into some reason why that feeling was okay.
Yeah, and there's a kind of aesthetic distinction there, right? Where, and I'm not saying I endorse this vision, but look, like just on a population level, there is something attractive about the contrast of, what some people see, including what, the shooter saw as a kind of silent death or a kind of bureaucratic death inflicted by, the healthcare system, and this like very active, very charismatic assassination, right? And I'm not saying that this is moral, but there's a kind of there's a kind of liveliness there that I think was very well recognized throughout history and maybe people are sleeping on in the modern day.
Seems plausible. Can I try out an idea on you that might bring us back through the zero sum competition lens into the media universe,
Yeah, let's hear it.
which is okay. There's two kinds of prosperity or wealth that you might care about. There's sort of like material wealth that's like, do I have enough to eat? Am I warm? Do I have a large house? Do I have kind of like, a high material standard of living? Is one type of wealth that is obviously important. People care about a great deal, that you can, free market capitalism is this magical engine for the creation of and we've had massive progress on in the past couple hundred years. But there's also, status effectively. There's also a feeling of belonging, a feeling of relative importance, a feeling of, you know, sexual market value. There's kind of like, you know,
That in and
people
of itself is a certain Substack genre. Sorry,
people
continue. Sorry.
people want to, people want to be warm and clothed and well fed and all that stuff, but very quickly what becomes much more important is kind of this like status goods. And unlike, the material goods are sort of like uh, inherently non-zero sum, right? If you can if you can make way more food, everybody now has enough food, and there isn't any logical necessity to have competition. Sometimes you might have a scarce resource that people want, but in general, you can sort of manufacture more material prosperity. But status is kind of strange because it's sort of inherently zero sum. If it's inherently positional, if my belonging requires somebody else to be excluded, if my being on top requires somebody else to be below, you sort of have this uh, kind of naturally zero sum equation. And maybe a lot of resentment and a lot of angst comes from sort of that fact, which is you sort of do have, a zero sum thing on one of the measures that people deeply care about. It's easy to say like, oh, people who are excessively egalitarian, they're just zero sum thinkers, they're falsely thinking that wealth is fixed. And that is a fallacy for material wealth, but it's not necessarily a fallacy for sort of status driven wealth. And if you accept that hypothesis, I think there's interesting things you can do with it. One is you can okay you if status is inherently zero sum, if you want to have people you want to have like positive sum developments, you want lots of people to be able to be rich in that way. What you really want are multiple distinct status hierarchies, right? You want to have a lot of different groups, a lot of different schools of thought, echo chambers, tribes. You can live in a world where I'm not the most important person in my business, but I am the most important person in my church, or I am the most important person in my family, or I do belong in this place, or I'm the top of my WoW guilds, and they don't know that meme at the party. Like I think you actually can have a situation where, if you and I, if you're my, you know, way more high status than me at work, and then you put a lot of your self-worth into that, and I'm way more high status than you in our bowling league, and I put a lot of my self-worth into that, we can actually both lead sort of like fairly satisfied lives. I think there's an interesting kind of like, if you allow people to have different tribal memberships, you can mint more status than otherwise might have existed, maybe optimistically. I think the other thing you can do is like harness it for good. Like I think one of the things people pay for on Substack is just status, to the extent that it's like, if when I subscribe to your Substack, I do that in part to support you and like in part to be cool. And then the amount that I end up paying ends up being kind of a multiplication between how much do I like it times like how rich am I, because it's going to be worth it for me to have status in something that I care about, to mean something to you, to mean something to other people who are reading this, who are kind of naturally the people that I respect and whose opinions I care about. All right, that's my half form take. What do you think?
Yeah, there's a very natural Gerardian interpretation of this, which is that the kind of visibility creates the situation where those kind of almost separate but equal status hierarchies become impossible. Where, if you're in isolation, maybe it's easier with, you have one person who's at work and is the top of their career at work, and then you have a different person who's in a different bowling league, not with the first person, and is the top of their bowling league. That's an example where, you would have the same kind of status, or you would have the different status hierarchies, and each person can be on the top of their status hierarchy. I think what Gerard would quibble with the way that yours is set up is that both people can understand each other, see each other, and will naturally begin to imitate each other. That would be Gerard's assertion. And they imitate each other not just in their actions, not just in, person one trying to be a better, bowler, and person two trying to be a better employee, but they would also imitate each other in their desires, in what they want. And what would eventually happen is that either both of them would want to be number one in the job, or both of them would want to be number one in the bowling league. Now, is that necessarily true in that case? I can think of like individual examples, like literal like people, individuals where that's true. Can probably think of individuals where that's not true. So, that's one interpretation of it. And if we were to apply that to Substack, then one idea might be we would want to keep the silos kind of the way they are. That, having more intervisibility between all these different silos and factions might not just lead to conflict, but might lead to mimesis and might lead to, one faction entirely deciding to copy the other faction and, copying them and, pursuing the same things that they want and so on and so forth.
Maybe what we really need the AI to do is to conspicuously want what we already have. On the other hand, I could see that going wrong.
Yeah, I mean, there's I don't know if this is that mainstream of a discussion in Gerard's thought, but it's like
I wouldn't want
my
to depart from
contention.
mainstream Girardism. We might lose the audience.
Yeah. So my contention is that a lot of Gerard, I mean the pattern, the kind of observation is more or less correct. But really, what you're finding there is that you're finding an expression of violence, right? So Gerard would say that the mimesis leads to violence, almost causes violence. I think he does explicitly say that the mimesis causes violence. I would say that the desire for violence is fundamental, and almost people kind of loop themselves into these status hierarchies, loop themselves into these mimetic status hierarchies because they want, in Hobbes's term, it would be conquest, but basically that they want violence.
Interesting.
But I think the really interesting natural experiment you have with Substack is that you have. Let me know. I actually don't know. So this is a question I have for you that might help with this natural experiment. Peter Thiel has a famous quote, many famous quotes, but one of his famous quotes is that venture and software is a very anti mimetic thing because you can invest in someone and the person you invest in becomes even more successful than you, right? He invests in Mark Zuckerberg and then Mark Zuckerberg becomes even richer than Peter Thiel. And that kind of leapfrogging where you have a subordinate kind of become maybe not necessarily the boss, but become higher in status. Has that
Sometimes
happened on
that's what you
Substack?
want. Has that happened on Substack?
Yeah, yeah. Like a lot of Substack people, Noah Smith, Matt Iglesias, so on, like brought in previous audiences, right? So they started off high. But has there been a situation where someone who started off high kind of promoted someone below them and the person below them kind of leapfrogged them on Substack? Has that ever happened?
Yeah, I think almost definitely that will have happened. There's definitely people who have come up from not being wildly famous before and gone on to be quite successful. I'm sure at least I don't have a specific pair in my mind, but I do think that has very likely happened.
And what's been the result of that? You don't have to say with who, but like if you do have, um, at least a general scene where that's happened, what's been the result of that? What has been the social consequence of that?
I don't know. I think maybe the way I might put this is, and this is actually true in Silicon Valley. I've seen it in Silicon Valley and I've seen it in Substack. I do think there is an impulse for sort of mentorship, for one of the things that people find deeply rewarding at some point is to kind of help the next generation. And I think that's a mode that's related in my mind to, because I'll tell you the other place that you really hope that the junior becomes the senior is when you're a parent, right? When you have kids, if your kid becomes much more successful than you know that's what you want. You couldn't hope for something more than that. And I do think that there's a related impulse of people who've found a lot of success in their careers. I definitely see this in among the tech crowd and the Valley universe. I see it on Substack where there's kind of like an intrinsic drive to help the next generation find their way, help them go on to be successful. And with if you succeed in that in a way where they kind of like go on to thrive and even to outshine you, that's sort of good. It's sort of like that's almost more rewarding than being in competition with them. I do think there's sort of you have to be in like a different generation kind of. You have to feel like you're not in competition. You have to kind of feel like you're at a stage beyond that, and you're sort of in this different, you're playing a different game at that point. But it's a real thing that people do.
Yeah. I think the point of Silicon Valley makes it in a very interesting way is because with Silicon Valley, it's like a very evidently expanding pie, right? It's a very evidently expanding like material universe and often like conceptual universe, right? Like Facebook doesn't become, an object of value. It's not like, Peter Thiel has starts off with X units of Facebook and then, Mark Zuckerberg outcompetes him and generates like 2X units of Facebook. That's not how it works. It's, all generated from nothing, right? You could say that's true with US dollars or at least US dollar, equivalent of Facebook stock, but like that's actually a very blurry description of what's actually happening, because what's actually happening is you have this entire, social process and ecosystem generated essentially out of nothing. And the contrast with Substack is interesting because on some hand you can kind of generate, new philosophy and new concepts that way, but a lot of it is more status oriented and is at least closer to zero sum.
I'm not sure that's true. Why should it be more zero sum? Why should the world of ideas be more zero sum than the world of startups?
Well, in a lot of ways it's just attention, right? And you can say that now with startups, it's also kind of like saturated and more zero sum, more competitive at least. Um,
I think that's an astute observation about attention. I do think that I sometimes joke one of the drivers of all this is like people used to get bored. You used to have a problem where you're like sitting around and you don't have anything to put your mind
I'll be
to.
honest, I still get really bored.
When do
I
you get
just
bored?
think there's a certain kind of like magic with some philosophy and some math and some like action, like doing stuff in the real world that I'm really drawn to, but it's very rare. And
Hmm.
with a lot of media, it's a very weird problem to have, right? In some ways it's a good problem to have because it makes it very hard for me to get like addicted to TikTok. Like I get bored of TikTok really quickly. It just doesn't feel like it's adding anything to me. And
It's like fundamental. There's lots of things that you could spend your time on, but they're fundamentally unsatisfying compared to the things you really care about. Yeah.
sorry to derail you, but so many people getting bored, or sorry, so few people getting bored.
Well, like basically, and then we solve that problem at least from a perspective of,
Yeah, for many people, I'm
is
sure.
there anything
I
you
know
could
many
like
people who never get bored now.
never get bored? At least there's like any slice of your attention you want to be spending on some media or something of some sort, you can. And there's only so many hours in the day. There's only so much, I think Netflix famously said their main competitors sleep. Like you get to the point where there is a zero sum war for attention. And in order to compete with that, you have to do what you do. You have to offer something that's more valuable, more meaningful, that appeals in a deeper way. I mean, I think I could imagine a world where by the time people are spending, a large number of people are spending most of their media time on Substack, it gets to be a zero sum competition, and to win from someone, to win somebody is to, for somebody else to lose. We're just so far away from that right now. There's so many people on TikTok who should be reading Substacks. That's not worth complaining about which Substack people read.
Yeah, we will answer the question in 2030. I'm not sure if that's a bit too long of a timeline for you, but by 2030, everyone will be on Substack. We will have, everyone in the world will be on Substack. It will be more than every meta app combined. And we'll have this, we'll exactly have this mimetic crisis. But invest in Substack while you can now, before we get to that point.
From your lips to God's ears. Let's hope that happens.
Speaking of mentorship, when is Tyler Cowen finally gonna get on Substack? He's the last holdout.
I know. Listen, I'd love him to come.
Do we know what's holding him back, as he said?
I mean, I'm. We've had like lots of people have talked to him at this point. I think he. I don't know exactly. I don't have it at the tip of my tongue. I think he's, you know, attached to some of his own things.
Yeah, Robin
he should be
Hansen's
fine.
here, Brian Kaplan's here,
Brian
the
Kaplan's
whole
great.
GMU
I love it.
crew. They're all
Yeah,
on Substack.
I'm on your side on this. We'd love,
Maybe he just wants to be, the contrarian. He just wants to be he just wants to be the exception to the rule.
time will tell.
Speaking of contrarians, what is one thing what is one thing that you believe in that almost no one in the world does?
What is one thing that I believe in that almost nobody in the world does? I don't have a pat answer to this prepared. Probably, probably good, worth thinking about.
Yeah, I'm kind of surprised. At least a lot of people have read 0 to 1 at this point. A lot of people have like canned answers for this. A lot of the canned answers suck though.
Yeah, I'm certainly aware of the. I think I've thought about this in the past and had answers, but I don't remember what they are, so they can't have been very good. Yeah, what's something I believe that very few people believe? Nothing on the tip of my tongue that I want to talk about.
Yeah, I mean, even some of the stuff we've already talked about. Maybe it seems obvious if you're running a media platform, but I think a lot of people would be, very surprised at some of the things you've said so far.
I will say I had one version of this experience, which is when we first started Substack, I would tell people about this new company I was working on. And I'd be like, oh, it's going to be this, new economic engine for culture, and writers are going to be able to get paid doing things they believe in, blah, 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 blah. And they'd kind of smile and nod and then tell me like, you know, I'm almost like, sorry, I have to be the one to tell you this. This all sounds nice, but like, it's never going to work, you idiot. Like nobody's ever going to pay for some random person on the internet that they just pay for someone. Like it's never going to happen, basically. And I had like a parlor trick that I would do because people would just be like, it's people will never pay for that. Those people would tell me point blank, I would never pay for some person. And my parlor trick was I'd be like, who's your favorite writer or thinker, journalist, whatever? And they'd say, well, Brian or whoever. And then I'd say, well, would you
Many
pay
such
$5
cases.
a month for them? And they'd be like, well, yeah, but that's different. Like that's a special case, basically. And so there was this kind of moment where I sort of like I felt like I knew something that was demonstrably true that people didn't even realize about themselves yet, which I think is quite common. I think people often are not great predictors of what they'll buy in advance. And I think that one is maybe gone because we've done the thing, but there was definitely a moment where I think that that could have been a good answer to that question.
Has anyone ever gone and said, that person, they would never go on Substack. They would never go independent. And like a year later, they do exactly that. Has that ever happened?
Many times, often the person themselves, many times, very common.
Well, glad you're with us, Matt. Yes, so Tyler will be here too. It's just inevitable. It's just
I hope so. I quite like him. One of the things I like in his thought right now is he's someone that I think is sort of like taking seriously the AI shift in sort of like a relatively intelligent way, where he's making real changes in his life and career and outlook, but in a sort of reasonable, like epistemic way that's not,
yeah, like really well calibrated.
join a doomer cult or sell all your possessions or take up heroin or whatever everybody in Silicon Valley is doing.
Yeah, I think almost the Peter Thiel op-ed, which should have been published on Substack, but the Peter Thiel op-ed almost gets at this, where I think there's a very wide class of people, and it's not really an economic class and more so a kind of psychological class, where unveiling and doomsday are inseparable to them, right? So the term apocalyptos, the kind of Greek version of apocalypse, originally means unveiling, right? And you see in the Bible, as the end times come, there is the unveiling of satanic forces. And I'm not sure if he's drawing from Gerard here or if he's just kind of claiming this for himself. But Thiel says in this op-ed that there's a kind of equivalency there, right? Where for a lot of people, if if the truth would ruin them, then there's really no reason to think of the apocalypse and the unveiling as two different things. There's no reason to think of like the Twitter files and like AI Doom as like distinct things. And I think that just, psychologically, that accurately describes a lot of people.
When this phenomenon plays out on social media, do you know what you call it?
What do you call it?
Inanitizing the eschaton.
Why is that the case in social media?
It's
What's the social media component of this?
it's just a lame joke. It's instead of immanentizing the eschaton, it's inanitizing the eschaton because it's inane.
Well, it happens a lot on social media, and I don't think it's inane at all. I think it's really consequential.
It can be
Like,
both.
I think when people reveal this stuff, including like really striking Substack articles, a lot of great journalism has been done on Substack as well. It does exactly this. I really mean it. I don't think it's inane at all, where people will unveil something very significant that has been hidden from the public, you know, and a lot of the time they'll do it on Substack. And I think it matters.
I'm with you there.
Right now, Substack is a very good home for like opinion articles, right? And a lot of the great blogs there have been opinion articles that do add a lot of value, but are not like they're not breaking news. And there's kind of an open question right now of both, the New York Times historically has done this and still do it to some degree today. And people are wondering, where will breaking news go now?
That's a great
Is that a
question.
goal for Substack? Is it a goal to have breaking news on Substack?
Yeah, and they're actually, I mean, it's a common idea that Substack is all opinion, but there is actually a fair amount of breaking news on Substack. It's one of the things that reliably makes people a lot of money when you break an important story on Substack. It happens fairly frequently, and it really does work with the subscription model. I think there's certain types of kind of like deep long term investigative journalism that's potentially hard to square with the Substack model, but it is certainly true today that a good amount of news does break on Substack. Um, I do think, and I think there's a lot happening on social media, on X, as you would imagine. One thing that I think might be underrated is prediction markets, and I think you and I disagree about this, but I think Polymarket is very interesting. We did like a little like a big sort of like push around the election last year, and we had sort of like two big spikes on Substack. One was kind of like on the night of the election, people were trying to figure out kind of like what is happening. And there was a lot of people doing that were good roundups of like what is happening and you know, what's in and what are the results. But honestly, like I think the best source that I saw for that as an aggregator that night was probably Polymarket. Like you could just see when things were getting called and how the thing was evolving in real time. And then of course the thing you wanted we had a much bigger spike the next day where people wanted to answer the question, wait a minute, what just happened? And then you saw a huge spike of people coming to Substack. There was time for kind of like the posts to come out and people to write the long form things that sort of made sense. But I'm very interested in prediction markets as a not a replacement for, but as an interesting accompaniment for what's going on. I've been following the TikTok ban through Polymarket, where I'm just like,
Yeah,
it shot
fantastic.
from 30% to 70% last Friday, and I was like, whoa, this might happen, or
Yeah,
this went
I
from might
think,
happen to like probably will happen.
yeah, I think, I think directionally we agree. I think we maybe just disagree in terms of like the magnitude. But what was the night spike on Substack? Like, what was the multiplier?
It was a big day. It wasn't like multiple times bigger than a normal day, but it was by far our biggest. That day and the next day were like very big sort of traffic days.
Like, yeah, let's say a week before the election compared to the day of the election or the day after. Best guess, what's the spike in traffic?
I don't want to say the numbers, but it was a big spike.
Okay, fair enough, fair enough. I mean, I would be very curious. Because the thing that happens is that it's not just Substack, right? I think a lot of people would be interested in what's the spike here compared to the New York Times or MSNBC or Fox News. So if you know, I'd love to know.
No, I mean it wasn't like a doubling, but it was a big meaningful big meaningful spike.
Okay, okay. Um, Good to know. Good to know. So I'll try doing like the binary search here, right? So it was less than a doubling. Was it more than 50%?
I'm declining the binary search. It was a big
Okay,
bump.
okay. Understand, understandable, understandable. But is there a Substack prediction market integration yet?
I mean, we did a Polymarket embed, and Polymarket has a pretty good Substack where they kind of like do some of these like,
Yeah, I
here's a
think I might be
story around something
subscribed
that's
to it.
happening. You should. It's good. It's actually really good. It's like I find it fascinating. But that's sort of the extent of it right now.
Will there be more of a Polymarket collaboration integration?
I couldn't say. I mean, it's something I'm interested. Like, I just think it's really cool. I'm sort of friends with the founder. I think it's like like I think it's fundamentally like an interesting social technology. It's sort of like a mechanism for creating common knowledge or consensus. It does sort of like for salient events in the world what a stock market does for values of companies if it plays out fully. I just think it's like a important, fascinating, like underrated piece of social technology.
One way that people are thinking of the podcast ecosystem and, social media in general is like, what happens in the case of a crisis? Like, let's say there's a crisis of legitimacy. No one knows what's going on, but you can somehow still get internet and you can still read on Substack. Like, let's say there's some kind of event in a foreign country where Substack is available. And, there's some kind of political uncertainty, some kind of regime change, and you just don't know what's happening. What are people reading on Substack when that happens?
What are they reading on Substack?
Yeah, what are they learning?
It's a good question. I don't know if I have like the obvious things, or you might see short breaking updates, people publishing notes, or kind of like quick posts. You might get kind of the like, you know, bits of news in real time as it occurs. And then you probably get like, you'll get the sense making, you'll get the reaction, you'll get the like what happened and why and what's going on. I don't know that Substack is necessarily, as it exists today, the like best dashboard of like who's winning the coup or whatever's happening in this hypothetical. But yeah, I don't know. I think you'd see a lot of interesting. You'd be able to get a lot of interesting perspectives.
Who is the best coup dashboard?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if it. I think that a well functioning prediction market could be a very interesting mechanism for, like, one way that I already do use Polymarket is just kind of like overheated bit of headline you see, you know, like you see something that would be like huge if true, right? And
Yeah,
you're
yeah,
wondering
yeah.
like, okay, like how seriously should I take this? And if there's a relevant market that's fairly well traded, you can kind of see, is this like a 1% thing or like a 10% thing or like a 50% thing, and get like a little bit of it can be a little bit of a antidote to the incentives in the headline game, which is like everything is scary and shocking and whatever the most like alarming thing is going to be true. I think there's an interesting aggregation property that prediction markets have. I also think there are people that you could follow on Substack that will have, good takes on relevant things for them. Like there'll be some, the right person to follow for some event will often have a Substack.
Yeah, I'll compete. The podcast producer that we are on right now, maybe.
Part of this, like I started doing, because we added podcast support, and I started making my own podcast. And I went through like Riverside and Squadcaster, and like just had kind of, it was just like it's kind of a big pain to get it all to work together and actually be good. At least I found it to be a pain. I was hungry for
Yeah.
something that was like more foolproof.
So returning to this topic of status, Eric Torenberg, he thinks very much about status competition, and at least my recollection of Eric Torenberg, which may or may not be accurate, is that he sees status as zero sum, and he sees the major lane of status as kind of like between categories, right? So he sees, for example, one big thing he talks about is kind of like tech versus, DC, or tech versus Wall Street, or tech versus, incumbent institutions, right? And he really looks at this from a status perspective, if I'm remembering correctly. And he's seeing, yeah, you mentioned before that, right now status is not zero sum on Substack because, there are many people coming to Substack. We're still taking status from the other categories. Do you think that there is a kind of culture in Substack of fostering this kind of united team of Substack versus all these other competitors?
There's maybe a little bit of that. I think a lot of people on Substack, you know, both like it and want to see it succeed and benefit from as Substack grows. It's creating more growth for everybody on the platform. I think there's actually a bit of an analogy between Substack and tech, maybe, which is, you know, one way to see it is that you sort of have like you know, a counterculture or a rival elite that's incubating outside of the mainstream, but that is like got new ideas and uh, a different system and is not doesn't suffer from the same constraints and decay as the old one. And then at some point, does the new system challenge the old one? I think a world where Substack topples social media still feels kind of like in the future, but a world where Substack topples the mainstream media is not doesn't feel that unimaginable to me anymore. And so there's an interesting kind of like there's a new counterculture, a new challenger. But then another thing that I think is true both of tech and of kind of like the independent media world is you have people that are kind of like constitutionally nonconformist and independent and
Yeah,
struggle to like be good coalition members, or people just so sort of like congenitally independent minded that they struggle to even like be part of a sort of a ruling coalition. I think you have this like a very analogous effect in both of
that's a
those.
very apt point to make in terms of the ruling coalition, possibly the current ruling coalition.
Could be interesting.
Yeah, maybe if they were all on Substack instead of a certain other platform, they would rule much more effectively.
It would be better anyway. I mean, and I do think that Substack, there is not any one Substack coalition. I should be clear. It is very much like an index fund of culture. There's like people from every tribe, from every team, from every, there's people from the mainstream. There's people from every possible perspective, and that's as it should be from my point of view.
I think the most explicit form of this is like BitClout, right? Do you remember BitClout?
No.
You know what this was? Okay. So for the audience, I know that most of them probably don't know, but like BitClout was this idea that there's a social media platform that is on some kind of blockchain and you get like paid for posting. And you get paid for posting in like cryptocurrency that inflates the more activity it is. So first of all, you're incentivized to post because you get some of this currency, but you're also incentivized to like bring people to the platform because then as the platform grows, your currency, your cryptocurrency becomes more valuable, right? That's kind of what I mean by like a strategy of creating Team Substack. And like didn't work out for BitClout, but you can argue that there was a softer version of that worked very well with many of the incumbents that are now incumbents today. That's why they became incumbents, is that they used this strategy very well. So you've thought about kind of cultivating that kind of Team Substack culture in that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the basic version of this is just network effects, right? There is an extent to which, because the Substack app and the Substack platform are now such a important driver of growth for most people on Substack, if not all, there is a degree to which as Substack grows, it's just very good for everybody that's on the platform, and so there is kind of like and we try to do this everywhere. We try to kind of like align our interest with the people that are on the platform, where it's like, hey, if as Substack becomes more prominent, if a bunch of people come from TikTok to Substack, although you might complain about subjective aspects of that. If the platform is growing, it's helping everyone. I think that's the most important thing. And you can create a financialized crypto version of that as a to make it happen. But I think the better version is just like, this thing becomes more valuable to everybody as it grows.
So you had this phenomenon with a lot of social media apps that were bringing on like people's contact lists. And the equivalent for Substack is, you're porting like the email lists to your newsletter, often very directly, right? Like I'm sure when, Robin Hanson signed up for Substack, that was like a lot of users all at once. What's the unit economics of that like? I would imagine that it's a lot more variable than people's phone networks, right? Is that right?
What do you mean the unit economics of email lists? I'm
Right.
not sure what you mean.
So I can talk about this from this is all public from the perspective of the growth strategy of kind of traditional social media companies. You had this virality effect where let's say Clubhouse, for an example that we had before. If you had like two people that every person invited onto Clubhouse from their contacts list, then let's say for a doubling time of like a month, then you would have skyrocketing user base that would be very difficult for the infrastructure to compete with, right? And in the case of Clubhouse, they had to ration the invites to be a much smaller number than that. The way traditional social media companies think about marketing is how to diffuse through friend networks and create those kind of invite networks. They focus very closely on multiplier effects that are usually like on a small scale. Usually it's like one person inviting two friends, right? In terms of traditional social media, have you guys thought about it in the same way in terms of each person coming onto Substack and adding X number of people?
Yeah, yeah, we think about this stuff, and there's two lenses you can use to look at this kind of growth. There's sort of like, I think of it as like a plumbing lens. I think of it as pipes and magnets. I don't know if that analogy even makes any sense, but there's kind of like two lenses you can use. One is sort of like a mechanical lens, right? That's like you come and then you invite two friends, or you put your Substack link in your bio, and then X people see that, and then Y click on them, and then Z convert, and then K become another thing. And there's kind of like what are the physical surfaces? What's happening there? That stuff all matters a lot. And those surfaces have to make sense. And then the other piece is kind of like the deeper piece, which is the value. Like, is the product actually good? And does it get better as more people join? And in what ways does it get better? And I think if you do either of those exclusively, you can kind of fail. Where, if you have a strong network effect where, ultimately it's like a chicken and egg problem. It's like, if everybody was here, it would be really good, but we have no strategy to get everybody here. That's sort of like you're stuck. The other version is you can make something that's like got such a strong growth motion that you can get this viral, sometimes you call it like the ring of fire effect, right? Where you can get this, like, everybody, get a gajillion downloads of your thing, or a gajillion new users in the door. It's so viral that it goes, but it's not actually, the hard part of making a thing is making it good enough to actually retain people and keep them there. And if you have too strong of a sort of a viral mechanic and not strong enough of a product that's good, you can create this ring of fire effect, and that can actually be bad, because it's harder to get somebody back sometimes than it is to get them the first time, depending on what you do. Like, if somebody gives up on an app, it can be hard to like get them to give it a second chance.
So all of this is a huge setup to a pitch that I want to give you.
Okay, give me the pitch.
So there's a certain guy who's kind of struggling with his company right now. That guy's name is Jeff Bezos, and the company is the Washington Post.
We've
And
had,
you
we've had
have
some
this
we've had
very
some people
valuable
join.
secondary network of writers, of very talented writers who can initially onboard to Substack and then have even more people within their network onboarding to Substack as well, right? Because each of those journalists will have, many people who read them to get this information and diffuse through that network. So, have you considered buying the Washington Post?
We haven't considered buying the Washington Post, but check out contrarian.substack.com. We've had a lot of high profile people go independent on Substack in the past couple of weeks.
Explain to the audience what the Contrarian Substack is.
Well, there's been a few. There was a really good editorial cartoonist. I think I'm not sure how exactly how to say it. I think it might be Ann Telnays, who was going to run a political cartoon, kind of lampooning Bezos, and was not allowed to run it, and then kind of quit in protest. And then recently, the Jen Rubin and another major Washington Post person kind of like quit the Washington Post and started a Substack called the Contrarian, and it's off to like a very auspicious start. So we're getting a good stream of Substackers in that exodus right now.
Yeah, this was just amazing. Like, hats off to Jennifer Rubin taking a moral stand for democracy. A lot of people are making fun of this, but this is the genius of it, right? Of Jennifer Rubin naming it the Contrarian. Like, I think she knew what she was doing. Like, she was going to name it the Contrarian. People would make fun of it, but like, that's free advertising.
We're happy to have them.
It is just amazing seeing the kind of, when Substack came out, there was this narrative of like, oh, it's just like posters and anons and right wingers, and the people who have came on, it's really been amazing with with Jennifer Rubin and with Noah Smith and Matt Iglesias and a lot of like incredibly like household names. How much execution did that take to happen?
A lot.
Is there, just choose any story that you can tell? Like, this can be, surely there's at least one that's like really fun. You don't have to say who it is, but you
I
can
guess. Well,
say,
I'll tell you.
the
Okay, there. I had a lot of conversations in 2020 that took the form of, oh, I've heard of Substack. That's really interesting. I'll think about it. Maybe I'll do it a year from now. Maybe I'll do it later. Yada yada yada. And I developed one of my sales pitches was just fuel up your getaway car. Start your Substack account. You don't have to do anything with it. You don't have to publish it. Just like get it set up. Just have it there in case you ever need it. And a surprisingly high fraction of the time, we'd get a call back, sometimes as early as the next week, saying, "You'll never guess what happened. I've been I've been fired, or I've quit in a blaze of glory." And I said next year, but we're doing it right away. And those are always very exciting because a blaze of glory is the perfect way to start a Substack.
yeah, and that gets to what you said earlier about people not knowing what they want. How else do you bring that out? What other tips when you were building Substack did you learn to bring out that kind of desire?
In the very early days, it was a lot of just talking about the future we were trying to bring about and finding people who were kind of able to see that vision and to be as excited about it as we were, kind of like before we had any right to get them. Like some of the early people who were really great, we kind of just like talked into doing it. I sometimes joke that like eventually, like there's kind of two reasons somebody starts a Substack. One is that somebody they really respect is on Substack, and they kind of like that gives them like a push to want to do it. And the other is that somebody they hate is very successful on Substack, and they go, "Wait, that person is making how much?" No, and those are both very powerful motivating factors.
Both very Gerardian motivations. So in the end, mimesis really is the growth strategy.
That's the one.
And you say you talk to these people, you say, just set it up. What's the alternative? So something I've noticed. So I moved from San Francisco to Washington D.C. There are really big differences in the way that Silicon Valley people think and talk and the way the policy world does. And I'm sure for, professional writers and journalists as well. What is the biggest thing you had to learn to kind of communicate to the kind of journalist or the kind of author crowd?
There's lots of stuff, and my co-founder Hamish is a journalist and a writer, and sort of like knew that world sort of socially and psychologically. And so early on, he was kind of like, it was like I had to learn a lot of stuff that was sort of natural to him. I mean, in the early days, just like the idea that you could go independent, you could strike out on your own and like just do something is like was a big leap for people. Um,
It was like saying you could, swim to Europe.
I think some people have felt like that. I don't know. There's a lot
Is there any more lessons you want to share on that front?
on that
Because
front.
I feel like this is something that you've got to be like, you know, one of the top 10 experts in, if not number one.
I don't know if that's the case. I mean,
Like
some of these.
understanding journalists from a tech perspective. You've got to. I really do think this. I think of all of the people who are in places to understand that you are like top 10 is probably really underselling you.
I guess maybe I like this isn't really a technique, but I've come to like I think the extent to which a certain kind of journalist and a certain kind of tech person are closely related species of a certain kind of nerd in like the same like the same general like there's a lot of similarities, I guess. There's a lot of people who are sort of like principled, independent minded, intrinsically motivated. I think sometimes tech and journalists have these like sort of like feuds, sometimes well earned, but I just like both. I like both. I think they've both got a lot going for them. There's good important things to be done by both, and if you have that, I don't know,
Yeah, I
starting
think
from
that's a
a place of
good
mutual
lesson to
respect.
learn, and it's a very Girardian lesson. The idea that they compete not because they are different, but because they are the same. That's the fundamental Girardian lesson.
Yeah,
As Shakespeare says, you know, I'm gonna find this line because I think it's just a great place to end off. This is how Romeo and Juliet opens.
two
Two
houses.
households, alike in dignity. In fair America, where we lay our scene, from ancient grudge breaks to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. Hopefully, tech and journalism will not get to that last part, but as the Capulets and the Montagues, that's a good way to think about it.
Amen.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Chris.
Thanks for having me. This was fun.